Before I get into laying out the body content on the interior here, I just noticed that the spacing, the leading, the line spacing between the two lines in the headline are a little tight. And what I want to try and do on that is see if the gutter spacing in the columns actually suits. It would be a good space between those. It looks like it's almost at that now, so I may have to go more. So what I'm doing is with the rectangle tool, I'm just choosing, I'm just going to give that a color. I'm creating a little square just so that I know it's the width of that gutter, and I'm bringing that down and seeing. So it's pretty close, and I think if I go a little wider on that leading, it's actually pretty much dead on in terms of the gutter spacing. So what I'll do is highlight this content, all of it. So I did Command A to select all, and Option and down just to open that leading a little bit. I just did 2 taps of the down key there, and I'll see how that looks. I'll move this back up. And just that looks a little better. It was pretty tight there. So that becomes something that you do develop a little bit of a feel for. You can just look at something and see where that little bit of tension was, and it really was in that area. It just didn't feel quite right. So I just wanted to fix that. And sometimes we do that. We make a little jig. What I did with the square was made what we call a jig, and I used that just to check the spacing. And it turned out, in accordance with the gutter, is actually perfect, but in this case, the optical factors of the typography and the white space and everything, it just felt a little tight. So that was something, again, where the grid isn't always going to match up what we're doing. It can certainly guide us in something like this, but it really is, again, based on that body copy. So let's get into that. Let's go down into the interior here, and let's see what we can do with this body copy. So I've got it started over up in here. I'm going to delete that, so it's all going to start in this area, and I'll actually make another type frame just to, for now, link it. So I'll go over to the overset with my main selection tool. I went to the overset, clicked on it, and I'm essentially just grabbing what was remaining in there. I'll click here, drag my type frame over, and we get the rest of the article. So right now we have all the content showing. I can probably get this to fit nicely in 3 columns into the these 2 pages. That would be ideal. Then I have a nice 4-page article, but I have an image that I want to bring in. I'm going to do that now just so I have it here, and I would kind of like to do a pull quote as well. So I'll go to File and Place. I just want to grab that second image that I'll be using. It's not a big one. It's not really a very nice image, but that's okay. I'll just bring it down here for now. I'll put it at bottom center, and I'll see what I can do with it. It's not going to be one that I'm doing too much of a highlight with, but really what I want to focus on in this part is really refining the content, getting this set up into columns. I think 3 columns is going to work well in this space. I may have to go to 2. We can, of course, always do different width columns. You could do a single width, or a single column that is a specific width, and then you can do a second column that's a little wider. That's fine. It's just really getting a feel for the right size ratios. But in this case, I think I just want to do a 3-column layout. So I'll do Command B, and that's also in the object menu, text frame options, and making sure that I have preview selected. I'm going to get this to 3 columns and just see how that's looking so far. So it's fitting nicely, 3 columns, of course, fits well within our grids and guides for this. We can leave the gutter at the default because that's matching our grids and guides. So everything's fine here. What I do want to do, of course, is get that justification set and then really see how the content falls that way, how much space we can absorb when we do the justification, and then we'll go in and we'll start working on the finer details of it. So the columns are good, and I'll actually do the same with this one. I'll move this frame up a bit for now. So we've got a fair bit of space to work with, and justifying this is going to absorb even more space. So I think we'll be fine for the amount of space we need for the image and for a pull quote as well. So again, it's looking a little busy, so I'm just going to turn that off, and I'm going to, what I want to do is set my styles, and I can of course set all of this, select it all, Command A. I double clicked in there and did Command A, and I can set it all into justification. And I'm going to do that because I'm not going to work on a single paragraph and then work through it just yet. I'm going to do an overall justification to see again the space that it absorbs, and maybe I'll have another spot where I put this image. I don't know. I have to remember the pull quote, but I'm just trying to refine kind of big picture for now and then move into the finer details of it. So I'll go to my justification with last line left there, and sometimes it brings up the note and sometimes it doesn't, the little label. So I'll click that. So that's justified, and we can see that we've got some odd spacing in it, but we also see that it did take up a fair bit of, gave us more space. It actually reduced the amount of space the type was taking, of course. That's one of the great things about the full justification. But I do want to make sure that this is all adhering to the baseline right now. I don't want to go any further before I'm certain I'm on baseline. So I'm going to select all again. I'll go to my paragraph settings. It's set to align to the baseline. I'm going to turn on the baseline for a moment just to be sure everything's fine. I know it is, but I always want to be sure. So it's all sitting on the baseline. That's great. That's important, especially with a columned type and when we have a spread. It's set within the margins. So I'll turn this grid off. It's set within the margins of the page. It's working with the columns and the gutters. Everything's good so far. So now we can really get into refining that content. Technically, everything's coming along well. And that's what we want to be sure of. In something like this, working a little more rigidly within the grids and guides, we do want to make sure that it's technically adhering to everything, and now we can get into really refining the typography and the typesetting. So I'm going to first, now that I've actually got the justification set, I'm going to select all again, and I'm going to go into my paragraph panel and do the justification settings, because I want to eliminate as much of those odd spaces as I can. So first I'm going to turn off hyphenate, because that's helping things. And if we can do an article without hyphenation, that's ideal. That's one of the little objectives I always have when I'm working with content like this. I'm trying to eliminate hyphenation. But it becomes a helpful thing if the justification settings aren't necessarily really working optimally. So for now, I'll turn it off. And we can see there's a lot of change, especially in the spaces that happened there. It really opened up a lot of spaces. So as we adjust our justification settings, we're going to see those spaces hopefully absorb quite a bit. So I'll went into the flyout menu here of the paragraph panel. I'll go to justification, and here's where I set those. So by default, this is typically what you're going to be seeing. And we've looked at this in past tutorials, but I'll just go over it again briefly. So it's showing word spacing. That's the space between the words. And we're allowing for a minimum of 80%. So they can come a little closer. and we're allowing for a maximum of 133 going a little further, the desired is always 100%. Letter spacing is the space between letters. That becomes even more specific because we're talking about the interaction, the optical interaction and flow between the letter forms and within a single word. So we want to be very minor with this. And then glyph scaling, that's any inked character, any characters we can see, whether it's a period or a letter or a hyphen, that we can scale those. And what we're trying to do with these last two, with letter spacing and glyph scaling, we're really trying to make adjustments that are going to absorb space overall across the entire article. They'll absorb a fair amount of space, but the adjustments will be so minute that really the reader's eye isn't going to notice them or be affected by it, and they're overall not going to hinder readability. What we're doing here with the justification settings is meant to optimize readability. So in the word spacing, I typically don't mess with any of these unless it's I'm starved for space in a novel or something, or even a magazine, but usually if I really need to acquire some space, I'll play with these, but typically I don't have to work with those at all. Leaving them at default is fine. On letter spacing, I'm going to go to -3%. So I can bring them a little closer together, and then in the maximum, I'll let them be apart 3%. And in the glyph scaling, again, very minor. I don't want to go too far because we don't want the letters to appear stretched, and we don't want to ruin the integrity of that typeface. So I'll go 97%, and I'm going to start at 103, and sometimes I even go up to around 106, 107, but I'll start at 103. And just as I click through, we can see a little bit of change on this. There we go. You can see a little bit of change, but it's not too bad. In some spaces I can see where I'm probably going to have to turn on hyphenation, and that's fine. I'm okay with that in an article like this, but it really did absorb a fair amount of space, so I know we closed a lot of that odd spacing. I'll say okay. I'm just going to click out of this, go into presentation mode, and see how it looks. And overall, we don't really see any bad rivers. Those rivers are what we see when we look at our content. We start seeing these spatial rivers that form in the type, and that's really what we're trying to avoid here. I don't see any horrible spacing. There's a little bit in this area, and I'm going to hold off on allowing hyphenation with that, because we're going to be doing the first line indent. And what that's going to do is absorb a fair bit of space, even on those first lines. So we have all the paragraphs here, but we want to get that first line indent set. On the first part of the article, we don't need that indent. That's the first paragraph. We know that that's the first paragraph, so we don't need to do that. We can do a little bit of, if we want to, we could do a drop cap. This is a name, so I don't know that we'd want to drop cap the H, but we're actually going to do that anyway, just so we can go through the steps of drop caps. But in this case, I may even consider, or I would even consider, doing the first word, in the first name, really. In this case, in uppercase, all caps or something, but we will do the drop cap there. And then as we go through, we'll start creating our styles. So we'll get styles with first line indent and any other necessary styles we need. But first, getting that justification set is what we really want to do, so we see the space we're working with, and then we can start working on refining that type with styles.